the theme of optical sound a little bit more, and I will go into some technical details and drive through some works of artists who mainly worked in the 20s and 30s. And I think I go for the 25-minute version and start right away. I'm going to talk about quite old technical devices that mediate between sounds and images in a physical way. I will focus on phonography and optical sound methods regarding the question of how these technologies have been explored in the arts. The visual inscription of sound, as reflected by Rainer Maria Rilke's essay Primal Sound from 1919, serves as a point of departure. The first part of this essay contains the technical description of the phonographic experiment, while the second part focuses on the lyrical translation processes between senses. Edison's invention caught Rilke's attention not only as a device for storing information, but also as a device for an audification avant la lettre of grooves and lines. In his thought experiment, Rilke attempted to deceive the phonograph's needle and have it scan the coronal suture of a human skull. So the suture is this line here, which goes from left ear to the right ear, and it looks a little bit like a soundtrack recorded with a phonograph. Rilke wondered what kind of sounds might emerge in the phonograph if the phonograph plays back visual curves that have never before been recorded. The peculiar character of the sound curve, which is at the same time indexical as well as iconic, motivated his exploration. It oscillates between matter and meaning. For a poet, this might be a somewhat unusual practice, but Rilke was fascinated with the infinitely delicate area of reality that might occur if the sound of the coronal suture would approach his ear. He knew this would trigger a new kind of audiovisual context, which could not be represented by lyrical metaphor, but still qualifies as poiesis. Even if the process is based on automatic transformation, this doesn't erase the artist from the work. Somebody has to propose these experiments. At the same time as Rilke in 1918 and 1919, the Dada poet Raoul Hausmann showed a strong sensibility for the potentials and limitations of language. He was in search of an optophonetic poetry. According to Hausmann, the optical appearance of the poem shapes the auditory experience. He thought of typography as an intermediate state between art and science on the one hand, seeing and hearing on the other hand. His letter posters turned into visual collages of various types. Quote Hausmann, "The letters of a poem are arranged in such a way that they convey sound," he wrote in Recherches sur le poème phonétique. Shortly after, in 1922, Hausmann described the photocell as a medium with which the identity of light and sound could be articulated. He proclaimed that no connections between painting and music in the sense of established genres and sentimental categorizations might any longer be acknowledged. The apparent correspondences between sight and sound have to be reconsidered. And it is important to note that Hausmann's concept of optophonetics is based on a unique mix of scientific theory, engineering, and Dadaistic dynamism. Hausmann's audiovisual art was informed by an optophonetic worldview, an interest in the fluid yet structural connection between the senses. This connection should be realized with the help of an optophone. Not unlike the 19th century color organ enthusiasts, he was striving for a possible link between electromagnetic and mechanical vibration. In his writings, Hausmann refers to the spectrophone invented in 1880. Alexander Graham Bell's spectrophone is essentially an ordinary spectroscope equipped with a hearing tube instead of an eyepiece. It demonstrated the radiophonic effect which occurs when any solid material is hit by an intermittent beam of light. it produces a sound vibrating in sympathy with the frequency of the modulated beam. In the spectrophone, the modulated beam of light is refracted by a prism and broken up into spectral lines. The device was able to show that the volume of the emitted sound depended on the wavelength. But Haussmann never built his optophone. He filed several patent applications without any success, and finally teamed up with engineer Daniel Broido to develop a calculator which turned out to be a very different machine. It remains unclear to what extent the optophone was built on the concept of the spectrophone, but judging from his numerous writings, Haussmann came up with ideas about how to change the structure of the light spectrum. These changes would modulate the overall energy of light over time, which could then be audified by photocells. However, his first written sketch of the optophone shows how incredibly loosely his theories were tied to science and physics. For his sketch, Haussmann literally made a montage of 3 existing patents demonstrating his concept of sheer mediality of vibration, encompassing sound, light and touch. And in fact, his willful neglect of meaning is reminiscent of his optophonetic poems. What did Haussmann suggest? He knew about Ernst Ruhmer's photographophone from 1901. When the machine was recording on film, it produced a variable density soundtrack, which was caused by the modulated light beam of an arc lamp. This visual soundtrack could be transformed into sound again by a photocell connected to a telephone circuit. Haussmann suggested to copy the spectral lines of the sun. Fraunhofer had found more than 570, about 20 times onto a film loop carrying a layer of chrome gelatin. This substance refers to a patent called the capacitive talkie, which Haussmann came across in 1920. Chrome gelatin is sensitive to the exposure of light and hardens and thickens during exposure. Those parts of the film which were not exposed could be washed away afterwards. This way, a chrome gelatin relief is developed. The relief, which is shown here, functions as a dielectric or insulator of a capacitor. The capacity changes with the distance of the electrodes caused by the scanning of the film relief. The induced signals were audified using a tube amp. In Haussmann's case, the spectral loops must have resulted in a heavily pulse-width modulated audio signal with rapidly changing spectral peaks. Completely ignoring Fourier's laws of transformation, but with the Dadaist enthusiasm, he set the spectral lines in motion, so to speak. As if that weren't enough, Haussmann included another invention, which is the actuator of Bell's photophone. So you can see the photophone here. It was actually able to transmit sound vibration through light, and the light could be catched by this device here, and then with the help of a photocell transformed into audio signals again. And this is the actuator. You could talk into the thing here, and the light beam, which was basically reflected sunlight, would be modulated by the sound. Haussmann's idea was to connect the upper electrode, this one, the upper electrode of the capacitor to a vibrating reflective diaphragm, as in Bell's invention. Not electrically, but mechanically, because the electrode was vibrating in sympathy with the pulse band of the chrome gelatin relief. A beam of light had to be focused on the mirror diaphragm in order to produce various light planes. It is not hard to imagine what the other sketches for his intricate machines looked like. And Haussmann made himself more than clear when he announced, "Dear painters and musicians, you will be losing your mind." Haussmann developed his ideas in a cultural milieu in which the interconnection of the senses induced by technology was increasingly discussed. Maximilian Flessner, who was a German military man and the inventor of the first earplug, for example, is cited several times in Hausmann's writings. Plessner contemplated in a somewhat post-romantic manner the future of electronic television and the potential of the photocell to audify different visual gestalts, like simple geometric shapes, crystals, and stars. Plessner thinks along the lines of Fischinger and Abramov, who made ornamental soundtracks which could be audified. But Plessner's works likewise recall Alexander Graham Bell's poetic description of the effects produced by the photophone. In a letter to his father, who was the inventor of visible speech, Bell wrote in 1880, "I perceived by ear the passage of a cloud across the sun's disk." A thought experiment by German physiologist Émile Dubois-Reymond provides another important point of reference resonating in the cultural milieu of the 1920s. Dubois-Reymond imagines what would happen if the nervous fibers, which are channeling our central perceptions, were cut and put together in a different way. Quote, "If visual and auditory nerves were crossed and healed, we would hear lightning with our eyes, the bang, and we would see thunder with our ears in a series of visual impressions." Dubois-Reymond gave us an ear for an eye is illustrated in a photomontage by Hausmann's friend, colleague, and Bauhaus teacher Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. McLuhan included this image in his publication Verbi Voco Visual Explorations, and a similar one in his book Mediums Camouflage. Message is conclusive. All endeavors will point, as Hausmann previsioned, in one direction, to an optophonic art. This will allow us to see music and hear pictures simultaneously, a starting articulation of space-time. In order to manage this articulation, Moholy-Nagy demanded generally binding relationships between the formal appearances of the curves of the soundtrack and their corresponding sounds. The topos of language occurs again, but in a different manner than observed in the theories of Rilke or Hausmann. Quote Moholy-Nagy, "To develop the possibilities of sound film, the acoustic alphabet of sound writing will have to be mastered. In other words, we must learn to write acoustic sequences on the soundtrack without having to record real sound. The sound film composer must be able to compose music from a counterpoint of unheard or even non-existent sound values, merely by means of optoacoustic notation. Obviously, such demands for an optophonetic alphabet reveals problems. First, the phonetic alphabet, as well as most types of musical notation, is based on cultural conventions defining it as code with more or less arbitrary relations between signifier and signifier. But the optical soundtrack is different from encodings of speech or musical instruments in the way that it displays oscillations of all sounds, speech sounds, as well as violins or traffic noise. It eliminates the human factor. It is an automatic visual inscription. So here the term optophonetic or optophonic with its linguistic connotations is rather inappropriate and first of all reflects Moholy-Nagy's constructivist ideology. According to this reductionist aesthetics, elementary relations and artistic laws had to be derived from the appearance of the optical soundtrack. But again, the photocell will audify anything, even dust particles on the soundtrack. It is rather optosonic or optoacoustic. Second, the picture plane on the soundtrack has to be conceived of as a function of time, of vibrations of darkness and light. Historian and engineer Donald MacLean put it as follows: "The mental leap here is thinking of the flat two-dimensional picture in space converted to a one-dimensional electrical signal, varying in time." Hence, the photocell can be regarded as an audio tactile medium in the sense of McLuhan, rather than a visual medium. The optophonetic alphabet inevitably leads to a crisis of representation. The image on an optical soundtrack doesn't symbolize a sound following any cultural convention. The waveform doesn't represent anything on its own. It rather shows the result of a specific technical operation. The inscriptive acoustic phenomenon is subject to a particular spatial and temporal milieu. John Cage's laconic statement from 1937, that circles on a soundtrack will produce one sound and a portrait of Beethoven repeated 50 times per second will produce another sound explains the situation. As a consequence, not only rotated or enlarged portraits of Beethoven, but also the same portrait only repeated 5 times per second will produce a significantly different sound. In other words, the relationship between sound and image breaks with the conventions of iconic identity and has to be considered inconsistent, variable, or fluid. Every temporal configuration of the apparatus affects the optosonic relation. Therefore, optosonic machines do not simply transform sound and image, but they equally inscribe themselves into the image, respectively into the sound. Perception is mirrored in the machines. With this in mind, the problem of audiovisual relations cannot just be delegated to technology and hope to find a vocabulary for a new audiovisual language. In the late 19th century, physiology, the methods of optical and graphical inscriptions of vibrations had already led to a universal belief in chronographic machines. According to Julie Marais, a good apparatus should allow an authentic expression of the phenomena themselves as a véritable langue universelle. In fact, this méthode graphique would be a universal language free from any epistemic constraints, but Marais' assumption had already been criticized by his contemporaries. With similar criticism, we have to approach the artistic belief in technology to reveal natural relationships between sounds and images. What we see and hear is strongly configured by how we perceive, and more radically, in the first place, that we perceive at all. McLuhan's dictum, the medium is the message, sums it up. The effects of media are part of the perceptual phenomenon as much as anything we try to observe. While neglected by physiologists, technical artifacts became increasingly important within the artistic practice. Paradoxically, again, Moholy-Nagy serves as a point of reference here. Succeeding Wilke's primal sounds just by a few years, Moholy-Nagy produced his now lost film, The Sound ABC. The practitioner Moholy-Nagy acts contradictory to the theorist. Quote, "In an experiment, I used all types of signs, symbols, even letters of the alphabet, and my own fingerprints. Each visual pattern on the soundtrack produced a sound which had the character of whistling and other noises. It's hard to come up with a broader and more vague description of sound. Thus, other noises are the sad remains of the optophonetic grammar, envisioning elementary relationships between sound and images. Yet, those noises are the primal sounds of sound film, no more, no less. There's no way to experience them outside the realm of this specific media technical dispositive. And it is not surprising that in extended cinema and in the experimental film of the 1970s, these issues become important again. For the production of his film Newsprint from 1972, Guy Scherven glued stripes of cut newspaper on a 16mm transparent celluloid film, encompassing the soundtrack. Afterwards, the film was copied in order to be projected. The huge blow-up of the projection results in an almost microscopic magnification. The material quality of the newspaper is visible. As a cinematic papier-collé, newsprint generates a system of empty spaces and disorder. The projected fragments of words run so fast across the screen, it is hardly possible to establish meaningful relationships. Hausmann's asemantic writings come to mind, but here the photocell reads out loud. Different grid patterns of the newspaper images resonate as whistling sound. Lines and letters create a rhythmic crackling. More than anything, Sherwin's newsprint is exposed to the contingencies and blind spots that occur when we try to make sense of our senses. Holding up the loose ends of Bell's sound clouds, Rilke's primer sounds, Fishinger's sounding ornaments, and Moholy-Nagy's sound ABC, Sherwin declares the ends can't possibly be tied together. Every octosonic machine operates within the realm of the endless potentialities of indexical vibration, transforming every other image into every other noise. This kind of aesthetic practice continuously puts into question what can actually be seen or heard. Emergent media technology, especially in its early days when it's still fragile and its surfaces seem clumsy and imperfect, brings birth to a new order of perception. It reveals the infinitely delicate area of reality Rilke has formulated. Alexander Graham Bell turns out to be no less poetic when he sums up his research on the spectroform. I think I have said enough to convince you of the value of this new method of examination, but I do not wish you to understand that we look upon those results as by any means complete. It is often more interesting to observe the first totterings of a child than to watch the firm tread of a full-grown man. Thank you.
Did you say the actual image of the waveform on the soundtrack does not represent the music itself? Or you made a point about the appearance of the waveform. What was your point?
Yeah, that the appearance of the waveform doesn't represent music as notation, as musical notation.
But would you agree that that's not true today? Because many musicians work exclusively in waveform editors, and that is the common representation for many people.
But they do not only work with a waveform, like as a visual input, I think they strongly work by listening to what happens, what they are doing.
Yeah,
and
but
the
it's
feedback of audio and visual.
But the visual representation is entirely, a set of waveforms on tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you agree to a certain standard, for example, you have fixed time axis, and you know your values on the sides, not as in, for example, those images that you don't really know. I mean, you could play this film with 12 frames per second, and it would result in a totally different musical experience. And if you have standardized values, and if you treat the musical, the sonic soundtrack as a sign and work with this in this respective way, then it might work as a kind of iconic representation of sound.
Representation actually changes because it depends what kind of software you use. Even if the size represents, well, more or less the same, then basically the actual image may change depending what you look at. There is a layer of software between you and the representation. So I don't think it's actually exactly the same. Of course, you can have an argument for another hour. I think that just the fact that you have a layer of software in this case. And the layer of software in interpreter, basically, and whatever the programmer thought about its approach to interpretation, that's how you are actually seeing it. While here, directly, you were able to. There was not that intermediary layer in between. Basically, you were basically able to directly access the music in a sense.
Yeah, the medium, but really only the medium. So it really represents what it should represent, nothing more. So the medium is also kind of a fixed system. Sound like it's 60 millimeter film. It has certain constraints and it works with certain speeds. So the representational mode is always very relative.
That's more presentation than representation.
Yeah, I think this would be good for for the 50-minute panel after. It is kind of endless, bottomless pit discussion. So that's interesting. So thank you, Jan.